Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video in which I tell you guys every single book I've read so far in 2022. So I've been failing at doing monthly wrap-ups this month, and so instead I've decided to wait until the end of June in order to go through and describe to you every single book that I've read so far this year. This is going to be a very quick overview because I've read 49 books so far this month, or this year. So I'm just going to be showing you guys the book and telling you guys my rating. I'm very excited about this, so I hope you guys enjoy. So first we're going to start off with January. This is my book stack. I read a few other books than this, but let's just get right into the books. So the first book that I read this year was Vespertine by Margaret Rogerson. I really enjoyed this. This was like a YA fantasy novel, standalone, following our main character and a demon. I love this. I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars. At the beginning of the year I had COVID, and so I read a bunch of books just really quickly in a row, and one of the ones that I read was an ebook, and that was Ice Planet Barbarians by Ruby Dixon. I finally caved and I wanted to see what it was like. It did exactly what it said on the tin, and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. Next up I read For the Wolf by Hannah Witten. This is another adult fantasy debut, following our main character who is a prophesized sacrifice to a wolf in the woods in order to maintain their kingdom. She was the second daughter. The first daughter was for the throne. I loved this. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. It's kind of like a Beauty and the Beast and Red Riding Hood retelling all in one. Next up I read Down Comes the Night by Alison Saft. This is a YA fantasy following our main character who's on one side of a war. She's got magic. She's a healer. She's bisexual, which I love the representation. It's kind of a gothic fantasy novel and I really loved it. I also gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood. This is another YA gothic horror novel with magic and really great horror elements. This was set in an Ethiopia-inspired world, and I really loved it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up I listened to the audiobook of Let Me Tell You What I Mean by Joan Didion. This was my first time listening to or reading Joan's writing, and I really loved it. It was really great nonfiction essay-like read. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read the poetry collection Calls What We Carry by Amanda Gorman. This was, Amanda Gorman was the inaugural poet for Joe Biden's inauguration in 2020. And this is a set of poetry detailing kind of stories about the pandemic, about humanity, slavery, the Black experience in America, and I really loved it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up I read the ebook that was Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique W. Morris, and this I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. It was a nonfiction story talking about Black girls and their experience in the school system and discrimination in the school system, and it was really great. I really loved it, and again, 4 out of 5 stars. I read this for my book club. And then finally I ended up reading Saga Volume 3 by Brian K. Vaughan. This is a Romeo and Juliet sci-fi adult graphic novel series. Is the best way I can describe it. I really love it. The characters are really dynamic, the art style is beautiful, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. For February I ended up reading 9 books, but most of them were audio or ebooks. I only have 3 to show you here right now, but let's just get into February's reads. So the first book that I read in February was The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden. This is the sequel to The Bear and the Nightingale, an adult fantasy Russian-inspired story. I absolutely adored it, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up I read the anthology Blackout by Danielle Clayton, Tiffany D. Jackson, Nick Stone, Angie Thomas, Ashley Woodfolk, and Nicola Yoon. This is a set of 6 different short stories following different Black youth in New York City during a blackout in the summertime. It's a story about Black love, and I absolutely adored it. I gave it a 3.75. Next up I read Heartstopper Volume 1 by Alice Oseman. My friend is borrowing my copy, so I don't have it on me right now. I adore this graphic novel series. I think everybody and their mother has heard of it by now since the Netflix show came out. But I am absolutely obsessed with it, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up I listened to the audiobook of Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This follows 2 main characters, 2 fathers, one black, one white, whose sons were married and ended up being murdered. The 2 of them have to come together and kind of reconcile their differences in order to catch their murderer. It's a thriller. It was really intense, had a lot of really great conversations in it, and I really loved it. This was the first Literally Dead book club pick of the year, and I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Before I Go to Sleep by S.J. Watson. This was a present from Tyler a couple years ago, one of his favorite books, and I ended up giving it a go. This is another psychological thriller following our main character who has amnesia. Every single morning she wakes up and doesn't know who she is, she doesn't know where she is, she doesn't recognize her husband, and she has to kind of journal in order to understand what she did every single day. This is a thriller. I really loved it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read The Perfect Ruin by Shannara Williams. This is another psychological thriller. I read this for Blackathon, the February round. This was the group book for the thrillers category, and I didn't really love it. I was kind of really vibing with the character. It's a story of obsession and this one person kind of gaining revenge on another human by infiltrating their life. But I was really dissatisfied with the ending. I ended up giving it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Then for Polarthon, I ended up reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This was a reread from the first time since I was a little kid. Almost everybody knows the story, a middle grade portal fantasy. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars this time around. Next up was my February book club pick for the month, and that was Punching the Air by Ibi Zoboi and Yusuf Salaam. This was a reread for me. I read this last year and I absolutely adored it. It's a story told in verse, inspired by Yusuf Salaam's life as one of the Central Park Five, a black man who was wrongfully imprisoned for over a decade. This follows our main character who has been placed in prison in a juvenile facility, and it's told in verse, and it deals with him discussing his situation, how he got to where he was going, and his love of art. And I really loved it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Finally, I read How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. This is a memoir telling Saeed's life story growing up black and gay in the United States. I really loved it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up is March, which was one of my best reading months of the year, and this is my little stack, and let's go through the books. The first book that I read in March is probably my favorite book that I've read so far this year, or one of them, and that is Delilah Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake. This is a sapphic adult contemporary novel following our main character Delilah Green, who has to go back to her hometown in order to help with her stepsister's wedding as a photographer, and ends up starting up this romance with a girl that she went to high school with, who's one of her sister's best friends. Love this. 5 out of 5 stars, no notes. Fantastic. Then next up, I finished Winter Night Along, which is a read-along that me and my friend Rachel over at Constellation Library were completing, and I finished The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden, the final book in the Winter Night series. I absolutely adored this. 5 out of 5 stars. I haven't sobbed this much at the end of a series in a very long time. It was fantastic. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of How to Pronounce Knife by Zivangam Tamanvongsa, and this was a short story collection following a group of characters that were all Canadian immigrants from Laos. I really love this. I thought this was a really great set of short stories. I love a good short story, and this collection was stunning. I loved the conversations about family and immigrant lifestyles, and I really, really loved it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Finley Donovan is Killing It by Elle Casamano, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this. This is kind of like a cozy mystery following our main character Finley Donovan, who is a struggling single mother who ends up getting mistaken as a hit woman when pitching her next book to her agent in a restaurant. She ends up taking up the job, and chaos ensues. I absolutely loved it. 5 out of 5 stars. Then I kind of had a dip, and I ended up reading The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. This was the March Literally Dead book club pick for the month, and I hated it. I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. I was not a big fan of The Guest List by Lucy Foley either, but this one I think was worse. So I really didn't like any of the characters. I didn't really think their stories lined up very well, and I just was not that impressed. I was especially upset by the ending, so, 2 out of 5 stars. Then I picked it back up again, and I read Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. This is a graphic novel following our main character, who's kind of a villain's henchman sidekick kind of situation. She ends up becoming the sidekick of, what's his name? Lord Blackheart. And are planning on wreaking some havoc. And I really love this. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And then finally, during the month of March, I read Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This is a Greek myth retelling of the story of Theseus and the Minotaur from the point of view of Ariadne, who's the daughter of the king of Crete. The Minotaur is her half-brother, and she is the one that kind of gives Theseus, who's the prince of Athens at the time, a ball of yarn in order to mark his path as he goes through the labyrinth and allow him to kill the Minotaur and escape. Ariadne does not have a very great ending in the original Greek myth, and so this kind of tells her story following that, in which she kind of finds herself. I love this. I thought this was up here with The Level of Circe by Madeline Miller, of a feminist Greek myth retelling. I am obsessed with it. I absolutely adored it. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up was April. Here's my little stack, and let's go over the books that I read. The first book that I read during the month of April was The Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. This is the first book in the Monk and Robot series. It is a set of sci-fi novellas, and it's set in a world in which all the robots have kind of become sentient, and hundreds of years earlier, all the robots put down their arms and decided to walk off into the wilderness, thinking that humanity didn't need them anymore. declaring that every century or so a robot would come out and kind of get the lay of the land and see if humanity needed them again. This follows our main character, who is a non-binary monk going on a pilgrimage. The two of them kind of go on this pilgrimage together, and it's very like plotless character study talking about humanity and technology and their relationship between them. I really loved it. I gave it a 4 to 5 stars. Next up, I read Read Between the Lines by Rachel Lacey. This is another sapphic adult contemporary, following our two main characters, Rosie and Jane. Rosie is a bookstore owner whose bookstore Between the Lines comes from her mother. She's got an online relationship through Twitter with her favorite sapphic novelist named Bree, who's a pen name. She finds out later on that Bree is actually the pen name of Jane Breslin, who is the property manager that owns, of the company that owns the building that Rosie's bookstore is in, and who has just evicted her. So the two of them have to go on this kind of mistaken identity adventure. It turns into a love story. I loved it. It was a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I ended up reading Daughters of Sparta by Claire Haywood. This one's a little bit of a disappointment for me. This is a retelling of the Trojan War from the point of view of Helen and Clytemnestra, who are the daughters of Sparta. I really liked this at the beginning, but then it kind of missed the mark on terms of like being a feminist retelling that I was expecting it to be, and the characters kind of fell flat for me by the end of it. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Everything was right again in the world next up because I read The Princess Trap by Talia Hibbert. This is another fantastic adult romance novel by my favorite romance novelist. It follows Cherry, who is kind of over men, who ends up getting into like a hot and heavy situation with Reuben, who is actually a prince of a fictionalized Scandinavian country. The two of them end up getting caught by paparazzi and have to enter into kind of a fake dating, fake engagement situation. I really loved it. I loved the conversations they had about family and actually a rough conversation about abuse. The romance was fantastic. The characters were great. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I ended up reading the novella ebook, Hear the World Entire by Anwen Kaya Hayward. This was on recommendation from Jean over at Bookish Thoughts. This is a story of Medusa, told in kind of a verse style in different timelines, talking about Medusa after she was changed, and is living in kind of a cave away from humanity. Everybody's kind of given up on her at this point. It's been hundreds of years since she's seen anyone, until Perseus shows up, and the two of them have a conversation and she discusses her life. I adored this. I thought it was a fantastic story, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I ended up reading the second volume of Death Note. This was a long time coming. I hadn't read the first volume since like 2018. If you've watched the anime, you know the story, but it follows our main character Light Yagami, who is a high school student who ends up coming across a death note, which is a notebook used by Japanese reapers, death gods, called Shinigami. He ends up finding this death note, and basically what happens is you're able to write in a person's name, a time, a manner of death, and that person will die. And he kind of uses it to kind of set right the world. But it follows him as well as Elle, who is a investigator who's kind of trying to find out who's killing all of these people in Japan. I loved it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I ended up reading the next Literally Dead book club pick for the month of April, and that is All Her Little Secrets by Wanda M. Morris. I really liked this. This was a thriller following our main character, who's kind of who's a lawyer in Atlanta, who's having an affair with her boss, and then one day she comes into work and finds him dead. She ends up taking his position and realizing that there's some really iffy things going on with this company, and her past is kind of involved somehow. I really, really loved this. I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. It really picked up. By the end, I loved the dual timeline stories that were happening, and the characterization was really great. Yeah, I really liked it. 4.25 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read the ebook, again, novella by Madeline Miller, which was Galatea. This is again, retelling of the story of Galatea, who's a woman formed out of clay and given life by Aphrodite. This is talking about her life years later. She's got a daughter, but her realizing that she's really just there to be an object for her husband and realizing she has no real autonomy. I really like this. This was very short. It was only like 30 pages. It was more of a short story. But I really enjoyed it, and I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Finally, I read and listened to the audiobook of Self and West by Joan Didion. I was kind of coming off of the high that I got from Let Me Tell You What I Mean, but this one kind of fell flat for me. This was just a set of a couple essays that were taken from her notebooks and put together in an audiobook. And I thought it was interesting, but it just wasn't as great as the last one, so I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is May. This was a much shorter reading month, but I really enjoyed it, so let's get into it. First up in May, I ended up reading the first volume of Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan. This is another graphic novel series by the same author who wrote Saga. This is a kind of Stranger Things-esque story set in the 80s following 4 paper girls as they come across a kind of cataclysmic, life-changing event. There's time travel, there's weird goings on, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4 to 5 stars. The art style is absolutely stunning. Like, look at that. It's so pretty. Really enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to continue on with the series. Next up, I read the Literally Dead book club pick for the month of May, and that was Confessions by Kane Minato. This is a translated work of psychological thriller from Japan, following our main character, who is a teacher whose young daughter was killed by one of her students, and it kind of follows multiple different people's point of views going through this event at this school. She's giving her last lecture at the beginning, telling her students that she knows what happened, and the story goes from there. This story took so many different twists and turns. I loved the different points of view and ended up giving it a 4 to 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of Between the World and Me by Tanese Coates. This was a nonfiction memoir kind of story that was told in a letter to his son, detailing his life growing up as a Black man in America. He talks a lot about the influence of Malcolm X on his life and his time at university, and it really fascinated me. I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Then I ended up reading the poetry collection Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong. This is the first Ocean Vuong book I've ever read, and it really makes me want to read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which is his probably most well-known work. But this is a poetry collection that talks about a lot of different topics, from love, life, happiness, his sexuality, his ancestry, talking about his grandparents as a soldier and a farm girl during the Vietnam War. And it deals with a lot of different heavy topics, but it was just absolutely stunning. The poetry was absolutely gorgeous, and I want to read everything Ocean Vuong's ever read. Since then, I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. Eurydice was probably my favorite poem, but I adored this. And then finally, I ended up reading Book Lovers by Emily Henry. This is one of my new favorite books of all time, completely unsurprising to anybody. This is her 3rd adult romance novel following Nora and Charlie. Nora is a kind of brusque, career-driven woman. She's a literary agent, and Charlie is a editor at a publishing house. The two of them do not get along ever since they had a kind of like anti-meet cute 2 years before the start of the book. I love the story. I love the relationship between Nora and her sister, and Charlie is one of my new favorite book characters of all time. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars easily. Let's move on to the last month of the year and go over the books that I just read in June. First book that I read is definitely my favorite book I read this year, and that is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a cozy slice of life coffee shop AU inspired by characters from Dungeons and Dragons. This follows our main character Viv, who's an orc barbarian that decides to retire after getting one last score and wants to open up a coffee shop in this tiny little town. It follows her on her journey of creating this coffee shop and building a community, and it was just absolutely heartwarming. I loved it so much. It was sapphic, and it was just absolutely perfect. No notes. 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I ended up reading Heartstopper Volume 2 by Alice Oseman, and this book made me sob. I absolutely adored it. This book focused a bit more on Nick than Charlie, and Nick is my absolute favorite character in this series. I relate to Nick so much, and this made me sob. Happy tears. It was fantastic. 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I ended up reading I Kissed Shara Wheeler by Casey McQuiston. This is the newest release from Casey, and this follows our main character Chloe Green, who is a aspiring valedictorian, the only openly queer girl in this southern Alabama white Christian school. The day after prom, the it girl, daughter of the principal, Shara Wheeler, ends up going missing. She's the only competition Chloe has for valedictorian, and she ends up going missing right after prom, but not before kissing Chloe Green first. Chloe is kind of forced to work with both Shara's boyfriend Smith and her neighbor Rory in order to figure out where Shara's gone. It was a really great little contemporary mystery and romance. I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It had great conversations about sexuality and religion, and I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. Next up, I ended up listening to the audiobook of Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is a novel told in verse, following our main character, Michael, as he goes through his childhood growing up in the UK as being a gay Black boy, and him entering university, kind of discovering himself and discovering drag. And I really, really loved it. It was a really great story. It was narrated by the author, and it was just a fantastic audiobook. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Then I ended up reading the novella All Systems Red, which is the first book in the Murderbot Diaries series by Martha Wells. I saw this not advertised, but I saw this featured on Maddie's channel over a book browsing blog, and it made me want to read it. This is a sci-fi novella following our main character, which is a android that refers to itself as Murderbot. Murderbot is a security unit from this company that kind of rules the future. If people want to go and do any type of surveying or exploring of the universe, they have to do it through the company and be given all of their equipment and stuff to survive, including a security unit like Murderbot. But Murderbot is different than the rest of the security units because Murderbot has disabled its governor's module, which means it doesn't have to follow any orders. All it wants to do is just kind of be left alone by the humans on its base and watch its serials, kind of like Netflix that it's downloaded. But one day another surveying unit on the other side of their planet that they're occupying has kind of gone dark and gone silent, and Murderbot has to kind of protect its group and figure out what's going on. I really liked it. I'm not a big sci-fi person, but I really enjoyed this, and I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up was the book club pick for the month, and that was Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a really interesting generational story following our main character Melody and detailing her life and how she came to be from the points of view of all of her family members, including her mother, her father, her grandparents, and her talking about herself. I thought this was really great. It was very short, but it was really packed a punch. I ended up giving it a, what did I give it? 4.25 out of 5 stars. But it was a really great story about family and generations and classism, race. It was a really great story. I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4.25 out of 5 stars. Next up was a Literally Dead book club pick for the month of May, and that was Hide by Kirsten White. This is a psychological thriller, horror, following our main character Mac, who's been given the opportunity to win $50,000 by participating in a competition in which 14 people over the course of 1 week play a massive game of hide and seek, basically in an abandoned amusement park. She finds out very quickly that things start to go very, very wrong during the course of the week that they are hiding. I liked this. It was not what I thought it was going to be, but overall I had a really good time with it. I think some of the characters lacked depth just because they switched between like 14 different characters over the course of a book that's less than 300 pages long. But overall, I really did enjoy the story, and I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Finally, the last book that I've read so far in the year of 2022 is Art Matters by Neil Gaiman. This is a very short collection of writings from Neil Gaiman all on the topic of art, and specifically books and literacy and its importance in this world. It's a collection of 4 different writings. One was a speech that he gave at a graduation commencement. One was an essay on libraries and their importance, which was my favorite. And overall, I just really, really enjoyed it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, and yeah. Those are all the books that I've read so far in 2022. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this kind of weird little half-year wrap-up, I guess you could say. Like this video if you enjoyed it. It really does help support my channel, and leave me a comment down below letting me know your favorite book that you've read so far in the year of 2022, and also your least favorite. I'm really curious. If you're new here, please subscribe. I put out new bookish and writing videos every week, and I hope you guys have a lovely day. Bye-bye.